Welcome, everybody. Man Talk Central. This is Colonel Esquire, your host for this week anyway. The rest of the gang is out. By the time you would have seen this, we try to come in on Saturday mornings to do the show and have the podcast ready for you and publish it by Monday, Tuesday at the latest. So by the time you guys will be watching this, Valentine's Day would have already taken place and the President's holiday weekend would have already gone by. And so a couple of us, had things to do. And so we're not going to do a traditional, or we're not going to post a typical episode. But in the spirit of Black History Month, we didn't want to let a week go by without talking about something, doing some sort of segment on Black history. And so here I am this morning. We're going to talk about somebody that's very influential in Black history, not just for Blacks, but all Americans in general. And it's only right that we talk about this guy being, since I'm an attorney, we're going to talk about Thurgood Marshall. So with that being said, let's go.
Okay, it's that time of the week. Let's get it. Indeed. Man talk, man talk, man talk, man talk, man talk central. That's what we're doing here. 4 dudes out of the mud, now we're ruling here. We give it to you, deliver like Amazon. You're listening to Kings and Champions. No matter what we're talking about, we're gonna give it to you straight, man, no doubt. No doubt. Hey, yo, we on our way to greatness. God's got our back, so chill and relax. This is Man Talk Central. Welcome back to another episode of Man Talk Central. Let's get it.
Thurgood Marshall was born Thurgood Marshall, June 1908 in Baltimore. And the thing that kind of stuck out to me first and foremost was at the age of 6, he got tired of people picking and making fun of his name. So he legally changed his name from Thurgood to Thurgood. As a young man, perhaps the person who had the most influence on him, is what he said, was his father, a man who always told his son to stand up for his beliefs. And so his father's influence was so strong that later in life, when he was interviewed, Marshall said that his father never told him to become a lawyer. He just simply turned him into one. And so Marshall kind of got introduced into law school, or introduced to the law, should I say, when he was in high school. And as a punishment, he had pulled a prank on somebody. I don't know what the prank was, but his principal made him read the Constitution. So instead of actually being a punishment, Marshall immediately liked it. He got fascinated by it, started memorizing various parts of the Constitution, and he took a special interest in Article 3 in the Bill of Rights. And so for those who don't know, Article 3 establishes the judicial branch of the government, and the Bill of Rights lists the rights that all American citizens are supposed to enjoy. So, growing up in an era or a time where Jim Crow laws were still, present throughout the country, Marshall knew that many minorities, particularly African Americans, were not enjoying all their constitutional rights. And so from an early age, Marshall knew about racial injustice in America, and he wanted to do something about it. But he also knew, or figured, or took it upon himself and decided that the courts probably is the best avenue to do that. So Marshall, later on as an adult, he attended Lincoln University, which is the oldest African American institution in the country regarding higher education. And he went to that school because he applied to the University of Maryland, but got rejected simply because of his race. And he went to Howard University for law. And that's where he met Charles Hamilton, who at the time was the vice dean of the school. And in 1935, he and Mr. Houston directed the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. And Marshall was his right-hand man, basically. And it was during that time that Thurgood Marshall realized or understood that separate could never be equal. The ruling separate but equal in Plessy versus Ferguson. Marshall always felt like that the only way for really an African American or anyone to succeed was to receive an education. But the discrepancy in the level of education amongst whites and blacks were made, pretty clear to him. It was definitely a different situation. And so the thing he talked about that kind of stuck out in my mind, which is pretty pretty incredible. So one day, I guess he saw, a young black kid biting into an orange, just biting down into the orange, not peeling it or doing anything. And Marshall felt that he had received such poor education. He didn't know either how to eat the orange or really didn't know what it was. And so from that point on, Marshall took it upon himself to pretty much develop a strategy which was aimed at ending segregation. So together with him and Mr. Houston, Marshall participated in many cases like, Murray versus Maryland, which was he sued his old school that rejected him, the University of Maryland. But later on, once Houston returned to private practice and Marshall was by himself, he took over the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Education Fund. And those are when really the cases that he tried really came to the limelight and kind of set the way and paved the way for the civil rights landmark decisions that we're going to talk about in a second. One thing to point out that Thurgood Marshall did, he tried over 30, I shouldn't say over, but he tried 32 cases in front of the Supreme Court, and he won 29 of them. All right. And a couple of them that I'm going to talk about briefly is Sweat versus Painter, 1950, and McLaurin versus the Oklahoma Board of Regents of Higher Education. And so both of those cases involved black men wanting to receive higher education, going to law school or going to get their doctorate. And in the Sweat versus Painter situation in Texas, they denied him solely because he was black. And they said, well, we have a law school for all black people. You can go to that school. You can't come to our school. But Marshall argued that the separate but equal, you're isolating all these black lawyers in one school. They're not having the opportunity to network. They're not having the opportunity to enter the job market with the rest of the other potential lawyers and all the other schools around the state. And so at the same time, in the McLaurin versus Oklahoma Board's case, that situation, they said, okay, well, we'll let you come to school, but we're going to sit you over here in the corner. When it's time to eat in the cafeteria, we got a separate table for you. During class, we'll set your desk outside, or we'll put you in the closet. So they didn't want him going to school, but then when they put him in the school, they gave him totally separate facilities. And both decisions came out at the same day, basically saying that it's illegal. You can't do that. You cannot segregate. You're depriving persons equal rights, basically. You're depriving them the opportunity to learn and have access to the same type of education as their white counterpart, okay? And so all those cases started out with higher levels of education, the colleges. And then he focused on public schools, primarily high school and elementary schools, which culminated with the decision in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, which essentially in that case, it was the court held that you could no longer separate whites and blacks.
Man, it feels good to be doing this again. Reliving the days of my youth. I haven't had this much fun in a long time. Colonel Esquire, also go by G-I-B-S-O-N. FMG on the mic. It goes 1, 2, uno, dos. If I ain't the best man, I gotta be close. Best thing since sliced bread, I gotta be toast. I'm a soldier, always guard the limits of my post. Yep, Man Talk Central. I'm one of your hosts. I'm on point, precise with the poetry and prose, making that grade like it's the end of the semester. I'm the crown flow, always under the weather, but I don't need a booster shot. I like my bar 6 so the music's hot. Delivering the kill shot, coup de grace.
And so after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, Marshall argued many more court cases in support of civil rights. And his zeal for ensuring the rights of all citizens, regardless of race, caught the attention of President Kennedy, who appointed him to the U.S. Court of Appeals. Now, in 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson appointed him to the post of Solicitor General. And so this person argues cases on behalf of the U.S. government before the Supreme Court. And that's the third highest office in the Justice Department. And so this culminated in 1967 when President Johnson appointed him to the U.S. Supreme Court. And until his retirement from the court in 1991, continued to strive to protect the rights of all citizens. Thurgood Marshall died in 1993, leaving behind a legacy that earned him the name Mr. Civil Rights. Before his funeral, his was laid in state in the Great Hall of the Supreme Court. He was only the second justice to be given this honor. And so I wanted to just kind of share that highlight or that segment and focus on Mr. Marshall, because again, I'm an attorney, and I just realize sitting every day in court, some of the things and some of the rights that we take for granted. A lot of that can be attributed to Mr. Marshall. Due process, equal opportunities to achieve and succeed things in accordance with the law. That wasn't possible, and so I just think that it was just, a phenomenal thing that he did. And I also wanted to point out that, it's a pretty good guess that he wasn't thinking about history when he was living, you know what I mean? He was just trying to do right based on what he thought he could do as a human being. And I just want to, send a message to everyone out there, not just Black people, but people in general. We are creating a legacy for our families. And so who knows what somebody may be talking about 40, 50, 100 years from now. It could be one of us. But regardless, we need to do the right thing in order to cement our legacy and build our legacy for our family and our children. And so Black history, doesn't just stop, with the people before us. I mean, it continues on. And so it's up to us to continue that legacy. And so with that said, I won't take up any more of your time. Again, like, share, and subscribe. We'll be back with a full episode next week. Be sure to watch our previous episodes. And for everybody else, Colonel Esquire, thanks again. We'll talk soon.